Well, I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about, well, I'm going to give you a few tips about writing grant applications. And I apologise to those who attend our Essential Guide to Grant Applications, because you've probably heard a lot of this before, but if you haven't, hopefully it will be useful to you. And I've got a slide that I want you just to peruse for a second or two and think about how you regard me, having seen that slide. I think at best and generously, you might think I did it in a bit of a hurry. But if perhaps you're in a bad mood, you think, well, she's sloppy, you know, I'm not going to give her any money. So in fact, first impressions count. It's just to demonstrate that, really. That's, of course, what it should look like. Okay, well, I thought it might be quite fun to look at some great writers and see what they've said about writing and how we might apply that to writing grant applications. One day I'll find the right words and they will be simple. So that's Jack Kerouac, another great American writer. It's not really like writing a research paper when you write a research grant application. You're writing for a much broader audience. You want your message to come through really quickly. So you're not writing for your particular discipline necessarily, unless it's a very specific research funder. So the simpler it is, the better, even though you may have to use some technical language along the way that you should explain very clearly. The first sentence of the book is a handshake, perhaps an embrace. A jumper here, isn't that lovely? So beginning of your research grant application, invariably, obviously, a bit of preamble about who you are, but the lay summary. Okay? The lay summary is a very critical piece of information. I'll say a little bit about that later, but it is the first thing people will look at, and you have to make a good impression there. People have to understand what you're doing from start. You can't rush inspiration. So give yourself time to develop your research ideas. You know, don't rush in, make sure that it's all fully supported and you've got everything done properly. I can write with authority only about what I know well. So no one's going to give you £750,000 if you don't really know what you're talking about. So obviously you all have your expertise and your areas of interest. Make sure you're on top of them and you're on top of the literature in relation to them. And I love deadlines. I love the whooshing noise they make as they go by. I'm sure that's quite familiar to you, Douglas Adams. This can work in two different ways. You know, if there's a deadline coming, you might want to try and get your document in on time. But if it's not ready, just let it whoosh by, because you know that things like RFPB, there are, you know, a couple, 2, 3, you know, slots a year, a couple of times a year, fellowships now, a couple of times a year. If you miss one deadline, it's not the end of the world, and you might have a better product to actually put into somebody if you give yourself a bit more time. I'm just raising this as a reference because some of the stuff that I'm talking about you'll find in this book. It's called the Research Funding Toolkit. Andrew Derrington also does quite a useful blog that's very handy about writing grant applications. So just a reference to bear in mind. And he talks about 4 key propositions in a research grant application. Firstly, the importance. So this project is important. No one's going to fund something if it's not important. Success. This project can answer the question. Value. This project will be good value for money. And competence. This team can deliver. And in fact, everything that you write about in a grant application should really be directed at one of those 4 propositions. So a research grant application is a competitive sales pitch, which is something you may not have regarded it as before, aimed at convincing a particular funder that your idea is important to them, so the actual funding body, your suggested approach will successfully deliver something meaningful to them, that what they will get will be good value for money, and that you and your team are eligible for funding and competent to undertake the work. So these are the things you want reviewers understanding from your grant application. But unless you can convey these things to funders, reviewers, and panels through your writing, you will not get funded. So the first thing they see is something written. You very, very rarely get an interview straight away. There's going to be hoops you have to get through. So the first piece of writing is what has to convince. And you don't get that opportunity unless it's further down the line to defend what you've written or to explain or elucidate. So it has to be clear in writing from the start. So who is your audience when you're writing for a grant application? Well, problem is you've got quite a range of people you have to please with the grant application. You may have an initial scrutiny panel who will be looking to see whether you're broadly in remit for the funding scheme. So you want to make sure you are in remit for the funding scheme. That's a big hint. You will probably, for a lot of funding schemes, not all of them, perhaps smaller grants, this may not happen, but for many, there will be some sort of subject expert review. So it'll go out to peer review. It doesn't always happen, but it does in a lot of schemes, most schemes. So you will have that subject-based technological person looking at your application too. So you do need to please people who really know about the subject. But at the same time, you're going to have methodologists like statisticians, health economists, lay reviewers, who won't understand all the technical detail and won't know your subject area particularly well. And then you'll have the panels who actually make the decision. And depending on the funding body, they may be quite a broad range of people, like an NIHR panel will have methodologists, clinicians, but they won't necessarily be in your area of expertise, lay members. Or you may have a slightly more focused panel. The MRC has particular boards who will look at panels. So they tend to be more broadly in a subject area. They might have a bit more subject expertise. So it's worth knowing who's sitting on your funding panel and the way the funding panel works. And you can usually find out by looking on the web. The NIHR very usefully lists all the people who sits on their panels, for example. So you have detailed readers, you have probably speed readers, and although we'd like to think everybody will read everything we write in detail, I can guarantee that at least a couple of people will have read them on the train coming down to the funding panel. So you're going to have people who will have read them very quickly and have to absorb quickly what it is that you're trying to convey. You'll have people who are unfamiliar with your discipline, as well as those who perhaps are familiar. And you will have lay representatives who are very vocal on panels. If they don't understand something, they get quite annoyed. So you have to write to a very broad audience. These people are busy. They will give up if they're not engaged with what you've written or it's hard going. So you've got to make it easy for them. So a funding application, like a picture, should not be jumbled up, unclear, difficult to decipher, confusing and unconvincing. I expect you can probably work out that what it is, but you have to work hard at it, don't you? It should be clear, unambiguous, easy on the eye, easy on the brain and convincing. So you just need to look at it and know what it's about. Yeah. These are the things I want to talk about quickly, and they're all S's, so they're easy to remember. Structure, summaries, story, style, sales pitch. They're all very important in grant applications. If you think about structure first, I quite like this word symmetry. It's not necessarily sort of mirror stuff, but if we talk about structure, the existing arrangement, mutual relation of the constituent parts of the material object, symmetry, due or just proportion, harmony of parts with each other and the whole, right? I think these are nice things to bear in mind when you're writing a grant application, because it's all part of a whole. Things relate to each other. Things should, be consistent with each other. I'm sure you're all familiar with what a research grant application looks like, the different sections that you're likely to see, but they all work together to make your grant application fly. So, if you've got a really rubbish methodology section, it doesn't matter how good the wings are, if the engine's no good. So everything has to work together so that your research grant application can fly. I think at the heart of every grant application are the aims and objectives. They are just something that appears about a third of the way down the grant application, but they are at the heart and the driving force behind what you're writing everywhere. So the aims and objectives will inform what you write in the title. It'll inform what goes on in your plain English summary. They'll inform the scientific abstract. They'll inform the background and rationale. You have to support why you're doing those aims and objectives. It'll support the research plan and methods, determine what happens there. The outputs and impact will also relate back to the aims and objectives. The project and expertise has to be able to answer and deal with the aims and objectives that you post for yourself. Patient people and patient and social care people that you involve in your application must also, be relevant to the aims and objectives. And, obviously the things that you're asking for to answer particular questions will require a budget. So that will also relate to the aims and objectives. It's really at the heart. So if you think they may come a third of the way down your grant application, but they flick back because the background section needs to support those aims and objectives, and the aims and objectives will flip forward and inform everything that happens in the methods. And actually repeating the same terminology throughout is very, very helpful for people reading grant applications. So that's about the structure and the symmetry. Summaries, terribly important. First thing that's read, I'm thinking particularly in relation to the lay summary. Clear, simple statements, no detailed arguments and justifications. Sometimes people go into a little bit too more much detail that they need. It's basically, what is the project about? What problem is being addressed? Why is it important? Also, breaking down the project, how you will successfully address the aim, and then how will patients and the public benefit. So what you have there is the overall aim, the problem, why it's important, the plan that you're going to use to answer the question that you've posed, and its potential impact. That's what we want to see in the summaries. We want to see some nice, plain, simple language for the lay summary. If you fail to gain readers' interest here, you are unlikely to succeed elsewhere in your document. And I've heard people say, if I can't see the importance of the project in the plain English summary, I don't bother reading anymore. So it is terribly important. Okay, story. What's the argument? If you look at grant applications or the background section to a grant application, it's not a rambling literature review, okay? It's quite a focused, argued piece of work. And if you look at them, they tend to fall into this sort of rather familiar pattern. Something is important, and you're giving a bit of evidence for why it's important. Its resolution would improve many things. Previous work has shown this, but it's deficient in this way, or we don't know this. This project will address the knowledge gap. When this project is done, the problem will be resolved. So that's the sort of structure that you see. We can make a joke of it. So I'm sure you'll recognize this. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. What's the story here? A study to evaluate the impact of Jedi Force staff training on the mortality and morbidity associated with the dark side. We're going to true academic tradition, having a DARF acronym. And basically, the dark side is a problem. We're giving evidence for that. It causes death, large numbers of people every year. It's been shown to exterminate whole planetary populations. It causes anxiety and depression. Costs are enormous, both for victims, but also rebuilding lives and civilizations affected. Removal of the dark side would be beneficial to many millions of people. It will reduce suffering and death, reduce costs to the NHS and other social health and welfare organisations. Current approaches to remove the dark side, attacks by small numbers of disorganised rebels have failed. Clear need for a more radical and magical solution. Preliminary studies have indicated the potential of force training for Jedi Knights in tackling the dark side, but its full efficacy and effectiveness is unknown. This project will evaluate whether or not force training of Jedi Knights is effective in fighting the dark side. If this approach is found to be beneficial, the dark side may be successfully defeated with resulting improvements in quality of life and longevity throughout the galaxy. So you can apply it any way you like, this kind of structure. Oh, that's until another Jedi Knight goes AWOL. More seriously, what's the argument? This is a nice nursing example. You know, leg ulcers, chronic, painful, hard to treat, reduce mobility and cost the NHS money. Improving the treatment of leg ulcers would reduce suffering and save money for the NHS. Current treatments exist, but they often remain chronic and unresolved over many months, even years. Preliminary studies show the potential of a new sort of bandage, for example, that may speed up healing. You know, this RCT will see whether the new bandage is better than current best care. If the new bandage is better, we'll be able to provide better care for patients, reduce costs to the NHS. So we have there, you know, it's a problem. Resolving it would be good. Previous work has shown certain things, but other things need to be shown. This project will address this knowledge gap. If it works, we'll resolve the problem. So we're applying the same structure to that as well. And it works for descriptive studies as well. You know, something is a problem. We don't know anything about it. We need to find out more about it. If we know more about it, we can then organise services. If we can organise services better, we'll have improved things for patients. So it can be applied across the board, really. There's a role for convincing and defensive arguments in your grant application writing. I've just given you a load of convincing arguments. These are the ones you want reviewers to remember. You also need to accept that every grant application or every research plan will have its flaws. There's no perfect research plan, and it's best to be upfront with those. Don't shove them under the carpet, but provide reassurance to reviewers. Write down the reassurance so they can see it, so it doesn't stick in their heads and niggle them and think, well, I don't think this is resolved by the time they've finished reading your grant application. So although we're only collecting data from these two counties, that reviewer thinking, well, not representative, you say, data from ONS show the sociodemographic profile to be similar to national averages. Results from the study should therefore be generalizable. Reviewer has it dealt with, doesn't think about it anymore, doesn't niggle them anymore, can move on. So it's important to recognise the difficulties that you might have with your research plan, address them up front, try and mitigate them where you can, And it means they won't stick in a reviewer's head and annoy them and remain on their list of unresolved problems with the grant applications and reasons why they shouldn't fund you. Another style issue, repeat key messages. This is an example from a real life career development fellowship from the past. There's an important point that Antonia was trying to make here, and I'm sure you can pick up what it is, and that's that she's got really good prior work. Not everyone reads the whole grant application. If there's something important, make sure it does appear more often than once, if it's a key message that you want to get across. And this, of course, addresses immediately the success criteria. If she's got really good prior work, it's more likely to be a success down the line. Keep it memorable. Apparently there's a sort of magic number 7. If you've got bullet points, don't have more than 7 because people can't handle them. And you can sort of chunk them together. So, you know, and you typically see this in aims and objectives and things like that. But, you know, don't overload people. But it can help people to remember things if related information is kept together in nice succinct bullet points. Keep it easy to read, so headline messages, not convoluted arguments. Use adjectives sparingly, use adverbs even more sparingly. This is an example of a beautiful piece of writing by Arundhati Roy. May and Amendment is a hot brooding month. The days are long and humid. River shrinks and black throws galls on bright mangoes and still dusk green trees, etc., etc. Beautiful writing, but it's not what we want in a grant application. We don't want lovely descriptive language in a grant application. Don't use typography to emphasize too much text. Although you might be tempted to put a bit of bold in the middle of the paragraph because you want people to remember it, don't put it there. That's just going to really annoy your speed readers who are darting their eyes all over the place. It's important to put it at the beginning of a sentence, and we'll say something about that again in a minute. Bullet points, numbered lists, not dense paragraphs with semicolons, short sentences, short paragraphs, simple punctuation. If you've got colons or semicolons, your sentence is probably too long. Here's another example of some lovely writing by one of our greats. I won't read it out, but it's the first sentence in a novel. It is one sentence, okay? And it's a lovely sentence. Some of you may recognize it. It's the first sentence of David Copperfield. We don't want writing like that. This is another example of writing. Outside there was not a sound. The house had never been this quiet before. All was silent. From her bed, Stella turned her head to look out of the window. Okay, do anyone know who that is? Probably not. It's Awful Auntie by David Walliams. So my message to you is write like David Walliams, don't write like Charles Dickens. Simple verb structures, use present tense, active form, and it keeps your word count down. It's quite difficult to do this actually, the project asks, rather than this question. The question to be asked by this project is, try and use simple language, breathing space in the text, and use subheadings where you can, quite directive subheadings so people can pick up on important messages. This has been doctored, but that's quite difficult to read. That's a lot easier to handle. That's even better because, if you're really in a hurry, you can just read pretty much the subheadings that gives you the main messages. Keep it easy to understand. So try and avoid your specialist acronyms. It is very difficult when you work in a technical area, and most of you do one way or another. You will be using jargon, but make sure that you are explaining it to people. So if you use an acronym, do explain it and explain it more than once. So perhaps in each section explain it, because there's nothing more annoying when you get to page 75 of grant application to remember that that acronym was explained somewhere around page 29, but I can't find it and I can't be bothered. Okay, so do repeat those sorts of things. Similarly with technical jargon and buzzwords, try and explain them. And sometimes you can sort of construct the application so that those who want to read that sort of stuff can, and those who don't have to read it, don't have to read it. So by clear signposting, which I'll mention later, you can try and guide which readers need to read this and which readers don't need to read this. Be consistent, so between sections. I quite like this diagram. Funny enough, yesterday we had a team development day and someone said, isn't useless learning about oxbow lakes. You know, what have you ever used anything to do with oxbow lakes now you're grown up? And I said, well, actually, I use it all the time in my talk because I quite like oxbow lakes because they kind of take a life of their own. You know, they're a little meander in a river, and then suddenly they stop being a meander and they start being a lake all on their own. And I think with objectives, quite often we see in the RDS people will have a clear idea of what they're trying to write, but by the time they've got halfway through their grant application, kind of morphed into something else. And so you find you lose that consistency. So in the use of terms, for example, directorate, unit, ward, overweight, obesity, make sure all these things are really clearly defined. People know what you're talking about and you use them consistently. Another example, I don't know how many of you read this. My daughter made me read it. It's The Silmarillion by J.R. Tolkien. You need a glossary, you need you know, a dictionary, you need all sorts of things. Basically, all the characters have half a dozen different names depending on whether it's the elves or the goblins or whatever who are calling them it. And it's a really difficult read. Yeah, so don't use this, you know, different names for the same thing. Be consistent. Be logical, so make sure your arguments are logical. Some people say however, and you think, no, that's not a however. What's a however doing there? It doesn't follow, it's a non sequitur. A logical flow of sentences, paragraphs and sections, and don't contradict yourself. So a couple of jolly little poems to help you remember to not contradict yourselves. Avoid spelling mistakes and poor grammar. I've already demonstrated how you might judge somebody who uses poor grammar or uses, you know, doesn't really spell check what they're doing. Try and keep the style generally formal. So avoid the very informal abbreviations. It's kind of okay in the lay summary. Colloquialisms and analogies and stuff can be very helpful. And there are some informalities you can use. I and we are absolutely acceptable in today's journals, for example. But we don't want, you know, I think, you know, I am convinced that, you know, you need to show the evidence that supports that statement. Quickly, some helpful writing tips. This is fantastic. You know, when I discovered assert, justify, it changes the way you think. We're used to writing, I think, when we write essays at school, when we write papers for academic journals, we tend to ramble on, we start gently, and then at the end of the paragraph, we say the important thing. That's not what you want to do in grant applications. You turn it on its head. The important thing goes at the start of the paragraph so that any reviewer, speed reader can pick up on what's important in the grant application without fishing around for it. It's simple and direct. And actually it's very handy if you're trying to summarize what you're doing. So this area of work is under research. Current therapies do not address this area. Previous work is limited and lacks methodological rigor, etc. Smack them in the face with the problem at the beginning of the paragraph. A beautiful assert, justify. It's the first sentence, Pride and Prejudice, brilliant assert, justify, because the rest of the book is all about that, isn't it, really? A truth, universal, acknowledge, etc. And likewise here, all happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. You know, it's a really good assert, justify for a novel, because then really it's a theme that runs through the whole novel. So ask yourself, if a speed reading reviewer reads only the first sentence in each paragraph, will they get the message? This is a nice example. Again, it's our CDF. These are the first sentences in each of her paragraphs in the section related to expertise and experience. I won't read through them all, but basically she's saying, I already have a career in this area. I'm well qualified. I'm an independent researcher. I have a good research track record. I'm already involved in research capacity development. I have international collaborators in this novel field. This project is likely to succeed. If you look at the assessment criteria for the then CDF, these first sentences in each of her paragraphs directly mapped onto those assessment criteria. So a reviewer will go through that going, yes, 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 brilliant. Didn't have to fish around for it at all. She smacked them in the face with it. This is an example of a background section. Just look at that for a second and tell me whether you can find a sentence that might be better than the current first sentence. The last sentence, I mean, what's that doing at the end? You know, what good is it doing there? That is the most important sentence, and we want that at the start. It's not terribly important for someone to know that a systematic review was published in 2007 and how many papers it found, but it is important for them to know that current early warning schools do not perform well because of numerous deficiencies in the methods used to develop them. That's what you want to smack them in the face with. Priming is another helpful technique. Basically, you're getting readers ready to expect something later on, rather like in the motorway, you're driving down, you'll see a sign about keeping awake while you're driving, and then about a mile down the road, you will see a motorway service station. It's the way it works. Similarly, each year 30,000 people suffer from this. You're priming for work on it. There's a dearth of evidence concerning this. Data will be gathered using its priming for a later resource requests, for example. Previous relevant work by the co-applicant is priming for the choice of personnel in the study. So, bear those little things in mind when you're writing. Signposting, I talked about that. That just allows, your speed readers to read something that says, I'm now going to go into the technical details of this, and they can, oh, I can stop reading that now. But your reviewer will say, your peer reviewer will say, oh, I'm going to read that. So it signposts people around the application. Linking, very important, connects arguments, helps to maintain the narrative, allows the reader to see the logic of what you're arguing clearly. So make good use of these connectives, but only when they're appropriate. Okay, and we can see in this plain English summary really good use of connectives. It takes you through, keeps everything strung together in a logical way. Tag phrases and labeling. This is to try and help your reader to become familiar with your discipline. Okay, as I was saying earlier, it's very important to have consistency in your terms. So if it's obesity, you define what that means and you use that term throughout. You don't lapse into overweight or whatever when you're talking about it. In this particular instance, although systematic review you might not think is particularly technical, it might be to a lay member. Early warning scores is something you want people to be familiar with, but you'd use those terms, throughout. You wouldn't change the name, you keep the phrase as it is. So, you may have particular technical terms that you use yourself, explain them early on, use them consistently. And by the end of reading, the reviewer is very comfortable with those terms. So be consistent in the use. Sales pitch, I had a quick look and see what salesmen are told to do, and I thought, well, let's try and map that onto grant applications. Know your customer. So scope and remit of the funder, it's easy enough to find out, and they have websites. Follow the guidance notes. Respond carefully to commissioned calls, because sometimes you get these calls that are asking for something very particular. Make sure you give them what they want. Know your product. So be on top of the literature, know where what you are offering fits in with that picture. Acknowledge the problem with existing products. So again, be on top of the literature, know what the evidence gaps are. Offer a solution to the problem. So you're producing an intervention or project that will solve the problem that you've highlighted. Say why your product is better than others. So know the limitations of other studies and produce something good that will address those limitations. Hook your customer. So a great title, a fantastic plain English summary. Make a good first impression. No typos in the title. Have a great team, a good title, fantastic plain English summary. Tell a story, have a logically argued background or rationale. By the end of the background rationale, people were going to say, blimey, I've got to fund this. This is fantastic. Address objections up front. So acknowledge the limitations of your approach and try and mitigate these where you can. Differentiate yourself, great team, original idea. Listen and respond to the customer. So listen to reviewers' comments if you get an opportunity between, stage 1 and stage 2, or, if you're fellowship, just you get some feedback before you have your interview. Respond to those. Don't just ignore them. They're the valid points that have been raised, and you need to address those. Dazzle them. So have a great team, an original idea, and a fantastic grant proposal. Show your commitment and enthusiasm in deed, not word. So I think as academics and clinicians, we're a bit Dr. Spocky. We, want to dot our I's and cross our T's. We want to make sure everything's perfect. But sometimes you do need a little bit of Jim Kirk. You need a bit of feeling in your application. I think that's probably more the case for fellowships, which are all about you, than perhaps a project role. But you do need to show your enthusiasm, your commitment to what you're doing. Quickly, just some easy wins. Address the assessment criteria. So keep them in mind as you're doing the application. I gave you the example of the CDF, hitting them on the head, in a very obvious way. Follow the guidance. It's such an easy thing for people to boot you out you know, because you just haven't followed it. Oh, they haven't got a Gantt chart. Oh, thank God, I don't have to read it. You know, so, you know, follow the guidance. And finally, give yourself time to do a good job, include everything that's requested, proofread in and out of your specialty area. So yes, do get your immediate colleagues to read it because they know about your subject, they know the technical aspects of it. But you go home, get your flatmate to read it, get your partner to read it, because they won't understand what you're doing unless they happen to be working in the same field. And if they can then parrot back to you what it is you're trying to do, you know you've done a good job. You know. And keep tweaking and adjusting and redrafting until your application is a thing of beauty. You can see even the greats like Leonardo had to fiddle around a lot before he got something that was really brilliant.